So hello and warm welcome from the EBRD HQ in London on the third and final day of our 2025 annual meeting and business forum. I'm Richard Porter, I'm the Managing Director of Communications here at the bank, and today we'll be discussing an extremely timely topic, which is how to navigate the complexities of industrial policy. Indeed, it could hardly be more timely given what's going on in the global economy. We're witnessing a significant policy shift in many parts of the world, as I'm sure you all know. They fell out of fashion for many years, and free markets reign supreme, but industrial policies are very much back. So if you think about the recent introduction of the tariffs in the US, Europe's Critical Raw Materials Act, and perhaps going a little further back, the China's Made in China 2025, these are all examples where we see much stronger direction of economies and protection of strategic industries. And while industrial policy can deliver significant benefits, under the right circumstances, critical questions remain. For example, what are the optimal conditions for it? How far should government intervention extend? What are the unintended consequences? And this is a topic that at the EBRD we've been examining for some time now, and our transition report, 2024-2025 transition report, examines industrial policies in the EBRD regions and beyond, and analyses their effectiveness and impact. And so before we get started with the discussion, and before I introduce our panel, our chief economist, Beata Javorczyk, who's in the middle here, is going to give you a brief summary of a report just to set the scene for us, and then we'll get going with the conversation. Thank you.
Well, good morning. What is industrial policy? I think the easiest way to define industrial policy is to say that these are state interventions aimed at changing the productive structure of the economy. They can take the form of subsidies, of grants, of tariffs, or local content requirements. And industrial policies are nothing new. They were practiced in East Asian tigers. They were practiced in Latin America. But industrial policy had a checkered history. And this mixed record meant that by 1990s, industrial policies got discredited. And the belief was that governments are not good at picking winners, picking industries of the future. Therefore, it's better not to do industrial policy at all. But now, as you can see on this graph, industrial policy is back. It's back with a vengeance. It's being done by advanced economies such as the US or Germany. It's done by middle-income countries. It's even done by poorest countries. Next slide, please. Now, why is industrial policy back? One of the reasons is expectations of the electorate. What we have seen over the last 2 decades is that people are happy to see greater government intervention in the economy. In this graph, you see responses to the question, are you in favor of more public ownership as opposed to private ownership? And the dashed lines show you where people in advanced economies stood on this issue, that's the blue dashed line, in the late 1990s. And the blue solid line tells you that over the 20-year period, people became more positively predisposed towards industrial policy. That's in advanced economies. The yellow line shows you similar figure for post-communist countries. So actually, people are happy to see government intervention. This return to state intervention is happening with the blessing of the electorate. Now, next slide, please. Industrial policy can work. Let me give you one example. Investment promotion is a type of industrial policy. National investment promotion agencies choose their priority sectors to which they want to bring more foreign investment. And as you can see on this graph, once a sector is targeted, it often receives more FDI. So in that sense, these agencies deliver on their promise. Of course, some preconditions need to be met. But And what's very good about investment promotion, which I understand here as marketing a country, as lowering the cost of entry, as helping committed investors navigate through the bureaucratic maze, the best thing about it is that if countries get it wrong, not much happens. There is little distortion that you cause in the economy. Now, next slide, please. As you will see in this slide, there are, however, some disturbing features of industrial policy. For the purposes of our transition report, we collected new data on industrial policies for 140 countries, and we analyzed characteristics of these policies. And the first disturbing feature of industrial policy is that in majority of cases, they discriminate against foreign interests. And that's by design. Industrial policy is about often giving preference to your own companies. It's about procurement by European, by American. It's about localization of value added, giving preferences to firms and products that are sourced locally. The second suboptimal feature of industrial policy is that countries are often introducing these policies targeting multiple objectives without having a clear hierarchy between these objectives. So think about Europe. We want to electrify transport. We want more electric cars on the roads. At the same time, we want to promote and sustain employment in the automotive sector. So introducing tariffs on electric cars help keep employment, but increases the cost of electric vehicles and slows down electrification of transport. Now, the third characteristic of industrial policy is that they are often introduced without an end date. So you give preferences to particular firm, particular industry, particular region, without saying when this program will finish. And once you introduce some giveaways, some preferences, it's politically often impossible to roll it back. And because industrial policy costs money, at this current time of stretched budget, signing up for spending a lot of money for a very long time is not a prudent thing to do. Now, moving on to the last slide, there are two things you need to do industrial policy. One is money, fiscal space. After all, subsidies, grants cost money. The second thing you need is the administrative capacity. You need government bureaucrats, officials who are able to implement the policy. So in countries that have both fiscal space and administrative capacity, you can do things that are complicated. You can do loans to preferred sector for R&D for particular purposes. You can give grants. You can assist firms to invest and expand abroad. But if you are a poor country and you have little money and you have little administrative capacity, then typically you go for these pink policies here. You go for what's cheap and easy, meaning you restrict exports by introducing licensing requirement or outright bans. You restrict imports. And these policies happen to be the most distortive policies. And in countries that are no models of governance, there exists a real danger that these policies will be captured by vested interests and will deliver more distortion rather than benefits. So what's the bottom line? The bottom line is that industrial policy can deliver, but it's actually quite difficult to get it right. Thank you.
Thank you, Beata. You can see the full transition report, which gives you a much more detailed explanation of that on our website. But let's get into the conversation, and I'll introduce the really great panel we've got here today. So furthest away from me, Jeremy Zettelmeier, who's director of Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. Next to him is Mr. Bernardo Sistini, who's chairman and CEO of the SIAD Group, which is active in industrial gases, engineering, healthcare, industrial goods and services, so very good for a manufacturing perspective, and a partner of the EBRD as well. Beata, chief economist and professor of economics at Oxford University, and then beside me, Leslie Masdorp, who's CEO of British International Investment, the UK's UK government's development finance arm, and the EBRD and BII have worked together on a number of important projects. So I should say as well that we'll be taking your questions in the audience towards the end, and you can do so on Slido as well if you're watching online. So hopefully the details are about to appear on the screen for those who want to submit questions. And I have an iPad where the questions will appear. In fact, they already are, which is good because we haven't even given the number out. So, the code, as you can see, is 2201242. So if you just go to slido.com, you just type that number in, and you can easily post your question, and we'll have some time at the end for those. Okay, so let's get started. I'm actually going to start with Beata just to pick up on a couple of things that she mentioned. On the why, Beata, essentially you said because people want it. There must be more to it than that. Could you perhaps expand on some of the reasons why it's made such a strong comeback?
Absolutely, there are more reasons. So first, there are new challenges. We want to speed up green transition. Countries want to do industrial policy to boost their competitiveness. The European context, the Draghi report is, to a large extent, about industrial policy. The second reason is countries want to do industrial policy because other countries are doing that. So European approach is, in a sense, a response to the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, Chinese subsidies in electric vehicle and other sectors. And the danger with that is that there may be a domino effect. If everybody starts promoting their own industry, everybody will be reacting to what everybody else is doing. We are going to be rolling back globalization and free trade and the sort of neutrality, the rules that gave a level playing field. And now there's also a new rationale. A lot of industrial policy is driven by security considerations. So it's moving away from the economic rationale where we want to address coordination failures, market failure situations where markets don't deliver efficient outcome, to a completely different justification.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I'll go to Jeremy just to pick up on that point about national security. That I think previously we all thought of industrial policy as being about correcting market failures, but now it is, as Beata says, much more about national security. Is that changing the way that you see industrial policy evolving?
It absolutely is, but before I get there, let me just expand on one point that Beata made. I think sort of if you look at the history of economic thought, there's always been some tolerance for discriminatory industrial policy in developing countries, right? So we don't treat developing countries quite the same, and this has a very old intellectual tradition. It goes back to Alexander Hamilton in the late 18th century, who essentially justified that in light of the overwhelming incumbency strength of the British Empire, industrial policy, specifically subsidies, industrial subsidies, were justified to get American industrialization off the ground. And that is essentially an argument that was largely accepted, even by free market economists. But traditionally, particularly in the last century after World War II, advanced countries were not particularly bothered by it. And the reason was that these countries were viewed as, in some sense, de minimis. They were not direct competitors. And this all changed with China. So you now have a very fast, enormous competing country that is perceived to have made it in part because of industrial policy, which is only partly true, by the way. For the most part, China made it for different reasons, by integrating into world trade. And so we now have a phenomenon that is virtually unique in economic history, which is you have a massive advanced country industrial response to what is viewed as excessive catch-up, so to speak, by developing countries. And that is actually quite disturbing. I mean, it is really a new thing. Now, like you said, there's also, of course, a national security angle to that, in part because these catching up countries are viewed as national security threats. And what this does is it changes, if you like, the criteria with which industrial policy is judged. So, typically, particularly mainstream economists like Beata myself would sort of say, industrial policy is fine if it addresses market failures, if it makes you grow faster. Now we have a completely different angle, national security, right? This is about safety. And in principle, that's fine, because national security is a legitimate objective. There are just two problems. One is there are often trade-offs between, efficiency growth and safety, security. And so you have to be quite smart about how you design policies so they don't set you back on the primary objective of industrial policy, which is productivity growth. Yeah. And the other, even bigger problem with this national security thing is that it is inherently requires, of course, industrial policy to be discriminatory. So for the most part, many of the advanced country industrial policies that are discriminatory, they are discriminatory because of lobbying, because of protectionism, not because of their national security policies. But once you introduce national security as sort of the main point of industrial policy, then it's great, because it becomes almost indistinguishable from helping the national incumbents. And so that makes it even harder than to pick between good and bad policies. So I'm actually quite concerned by this trend that you're describing.
Thank you. That's really interesting. We might come back to excessive catch-up as a concept. I think actually that's an interesting one. Bernardo, as the private sector representative, where do you stand on industrial policies? Are they a good thing for the private sector?
Thank you for the question, and good morning to everybody. The industrial policy sure is very important for all the sector, private or public. I coming from Italy, and you know that our country, historically, the industrial policy was very short, because in the last 20 years, our change in the prime minister was very fast and very short. Today, I'm proud to be Italian, because with our new prime minister, we are looking at industrial policy for the country, much more longer view, and this is, I think, can be very good for the Italian industry. Our group are present not just in Italy, in some other country, but I say that industrial policy for me has to be clear, durable, and what some other colleagues say, that is necessary, that have not just helping the company or the business segment, have to help the entire country, not just forgo against another country in some sector, like the automotive industry. You saw the results here in England and also in Italy, that for helping just a business segment, we almost destroy the industry. This is my point of view.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. I'm going to come to Leslie as well, who has a perspective maybe more similar to the EBRD. So how do you see industrial policy evolving in the economies that you're working in, and maybe perhaps overlapping with us as well?
Thank you very much, Richard, and Beata gave an excellent sort of overview of the issues involved here. But I think, as Beata sort of referenced, this has been coming sort of for some time now. I mean, I happen to have lived in China over the last decade. For 9 years, I was chief financial officer of another bank called the New Development Bank. And I've seen how that country has successfully utilized industrial policy to fast track and accelerate the sort of green transition, and use the green transition as a source of competitive advantage, and using the green industries, whether it be electric vehicles, battery storage, solar power, wind power, nurturing these industries, developing the industrial capability, and identifying upfront the potential for the green transition to be a stimulator of jobs, to stimulate the domestic growth. So I think industrial policy has played a very vital role in that country, but in many other developing countries, in helping countries to kind of carve out a competitive advantage for themselves. Today, for example, it's no accident that BYD is one of the leading global electric vehicle manufacturers, because it went through a period where the ecosystem, there was a conducive ecosystem created within which an individual company could succeed. You cannot have a successful EV industry unless you have local government, unless you have a whole series of initiatives that create, all the charging stations, and you need planning at a much bigger scale than the powers of an individual company. So one can make a very compelling case that industrial policy will have its moment in the sun, particularly to facilitate the green transition. It's no coincidence that the European Union have the EU Green Deal, the United States put in place the Inflation Reduction Act. As you know, it's got nothing really to do with inflation. It's really about a green manufacturing stimulus that President Biden put in place. And it had a major impact on the United States. I guess in short, what I'm saying, Richard, is that in both developing countries as well as developed world, industrial policy today is an important strategic coordination tool for countries. It adds to the toolkit to make your country more effective. But I think Beata pointed out to the dangers inherent in that as well. As it kind of stimulates and creates more sort of grounds for protectionism, which in and of itself have negative consequences.
Can I just follow up quickly on in terms of the role that you play now, and it's obviously very strongly informed by all of that experience. What's the space for development finance institutions to be operating here then to make that work successfully?
As you know, the development finance institutions, or I would divide the universe really into sort of two components. One, you have your multilateral institutions like EBRD, World Bank, Asia Development Bank, and so on. And then you have your bilateral DFIs like BII, Proparco, FMO, DEG, and so on. The advantage that the multilaterals have is that they have a natural access into the public policy domain, into sort of regulatory reform, policy reform. We work in the private sector as BII or as Proparco, FMO, all the other private sector focused bilateral DFIs. We invest in businesses with the development impact. We don't really engage in sort of discussions with governments around, designing the sort of putting in place the policy and regulatory architecture. But that policy and regulatory architecture is a vital element for individual companies to succeed. So we see for example, we do as BII, about 50% of our work is focused on the African continent. And in sub-Saharan Africa, as you know, where EBRD is also now active, we have many frontier markets with features of fragility, markets that are not very well established. So there it's even more important for governments to put in place the rules of the game, the enabling institutions in order for private sector companies to be successful. So we're very supportive of those endeavors, and we like to work in a symbiotic way with the likes of EBRD, who, as you embark on your entree into Africa, will be a very strong partner with us.
Okay. Yeah, I was just thinking actually we may have some things to learn from you guys as we embark on our own sub-Saharan Africa work. But okay, let's go back to Beata then. So again, staying within the context of our economies, Beata, what do you think have been the key structural shifts that you've seen in our countries resulting from industrial policy?
So the traditional growth model is moving from agriculture to manufacturing to services. And what you have seen in our countries of operations is that they have followed it in a sense that importance of manufacturing in GDP has been declining, services have been gaining importance. Turkey is the only country that seems to have defied this trend in a very significant way, by first seeing a decline in manufacturing and then a rebound, quite a significant rebound. Now, growing through manufacturing alone has become much harder, to use Jeremy's phrase, due to excessive success of China, which made competing in international markets for countries that are entering export markets very hard. And actually, when we looked at what were the drivers of growth in our countries of operation, before the global financial crisis, it was between export-led growth, so exporting goods. Some countries were using exports of goods and services as the driver. Some were using sort of domestic sources. But after the global financial crisis, the instances of growth through exports of goods have become much less frequent. So, and now with globalization being rolled back with higher tariffs, it's going to be even more difficult to achieve. Okay. Now, the success of our countries has been export of services. You see countries as diverse as Ukraine, Serbia, Armenia, or Estonia having exports of services on the order of, a few percentage points of GDP. So that's very encouraging. That's due to high education levels, which in many cases are a legacy of their socialist past. Interestingly, Central Asia is not taking advantage of that as much as they could, given their education levels, perhaps because services sectors are more sensitive to business climate and to institutions.
Okay. Let me follow through on working in our regions with Bernardo next, actually. Bernardo, if I could ask you, what kind of industrial policies are you looking for in the countries, not Italy, but in the other countries that you're working in? So Croatia, Serbia, for example, I think are places where you're active.
I have to say that in this country, and thanks also to the action of EBRD, because I know this, because the EBRD, they finance us 2 projects, one in Serbia and one in Croatia. Before finance this, they analyze our project in a good details aspect, and I think this is very important because can help to develop also the industrial policy. And I think with the roles of EBRD has today, that finance and they support a lot of projects in this country, is one of the entities that can know very well the needs of the industry. And the needs of the industry today, with all the shock that we had in the last 5 years, pandemic, energy cost, and the war, every business segment is really different from others. And also this was before, but also in the same country or in the same region, to know in the details the aspect of the need of a business segment is very important for develop a right industrial policy. And I think that today EBRD, for my knowledge, can be have the role to reinforce and to help the government to put in place the best industrial policy for the development of a country.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like you're more in favour of industrial policy than you are against, yes?
No, yes, if the industrial policy are made, also because we cannot live without industrial policy, because if I took an example, my group, the budget is the line of developing of the year activity, and the industrial policy is the guideline for develop a country. The important is how deeply and how consistent are the industrial policy.
Okay, thank you. Excuse me. Jeremy, I'm going to come to you now. The excessive catch-up point was sort of, it implies very strongly the kind of political dimension to all of this, which is clearly there and needs to be discussed. Do you think, do industrial policies contribute to geopolitical tension and fragmentation, or do they actually mitigate?
Yeah. I mean, so first, before I become famous as the person that claims that China has excessively caught up, let me strongly rebut that. Okay, I'm not saying China has excessively caught up. I was characterizing the attitude or the reaction of some advanced countries, right? But it's still worth thinking about this. So what has happened, I mean, first of all, China is still a relatively poor country. It has way to go until it catches up on living standards, which of course is what ultimately matters. It has not excessively caught up in that sense. What it has done is it has caught up on technology. And that, again, in itself would not be a problem, even from the perspective of the competing countries, were it not for 2 additional facts that are completely China-specific. One is sheer size. It's an enormous country, so it's an enormous exporter. And the other one is the so-called overcapacity problem. And that overcapacity problem, from the perspective of macroeconomists, is just another way of saying that China saves and invests too much domestically. And so it produces a glut of industrial goods, and that is clearly a result of a distortion, right? And so that is indeed a problem. So it's the interaction of these three things. But I mean, clearly the answer is that if we really believe that most industrial policy is discriminatory, like is documented in the latest transition report, then yes, these policies raise tensions. They often trigger a response, and so that response can be another subsidies raise, a point also made by Beata in her first answer, or it can be worse. It can be tariffs, and in that sense, it can contribute. Now, I think one thing that at some point Beata has to maybe explain is, I still think, these numbers are implausibly high, like almost 100% of industrial policy in advanced countries are discriminatory. And so I think it may be quite good to unpack two elements that might be driving this classification. One is that, by design, if you're going to subsidize someone, you're going to subsidize firms in your jurisdiction. So that's almost definitional. But that for me is not discriminatory. For me, discriminatory is if you go the extra mile of being nasty to the foreign interests, for example, through local content requirements, right? And that, I think, is the new thing. And what is also new is that this has become increasingly accepted as a defensive measure in advanced countries. It's in the Draghi report, right? The saintly Draghi actually advocates local content requirements. That is pretty disturbing to me, even though I love Draghi, I love the Draghi report, okay? In almost every other aspect.
Okay, thank you. By the way, what you said about excessive catch-up, that was exactly how I understood it.
Yes, thank you, Richard. Thank you.
I don't think you...
Yeah, that's right. I do want to go back to China.
But actually, let's go to Beata, and she can defend herself on the discriminatory point. So.
Absolutely. So it's very difficult to find the data on what countries are doing. So what we've done is we followed the academic literature, which analyzed the data collected by the Global Trade Alert started by Simon Evenet at St. Gallen University. And this database collects announcements of policies, and by the nature of their interest, that's a bit tilted towards policies that have also international, in a sense, spillovers. So essentially what was done was we feed this database through a machine learning model, and then this model classifies each policy announcement as industrial policy or not, and what type of industrial policy it is. So it's not, I think, misclassification, it's rather the nature of the data source. Now, I believe that the World Bank has now 3 ongoing initiatives on industrial policy, and I think they are going to look at sort of more detailed at other aspects of policies. But if I may jump into this sort of international dimension, what are the potential downsides internationally? So one is, of course, undoing globalization by giving preference to your players and making foreign firms disadvantaged. The second one is it's also easy to overpay. You mentioned subsidy raise. If everybody in the world will be offering great subsidies, firms will choose. Bernardo will choose the location which offers the most, and then perhaps that government will overpay. Maybe Bernardo would have invested without that. And the third reason is, and that's what you alluded to, is that there are spillovers across sectors and across countries. Think about countries that want to develop, so they restrict exports of minerals. And that may increase prices of globally.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Leslie, maybe you'd like to come in on this point as well about the sort of political dimension to it.
Sure. I mean, I think that the one area which we haven't touched on yet that I want to sort of throw into the conversation is the need for industrial policy around what is generally referred to as the just transition, or the just energy transition, if you like. Now, this concept sort of emerged way before the Paris Agreement already, but certainly since Paris Agreement has become much more in vogue. And in 2021 at COP in Glasgow, it very much got sort of embedded in the discourse. And my country, where I come from, South Africa, for example, has a huge coal-fired power energy grid. Now, the green transition, as you know, Richard, will have both, or has both winners and losers. A lot of workers will be displaced, will lose their jobs. A lot of communities will be displaced. You'll have stranded assets. Let's take this province called Mpumalanga in South Africa. Almost 60-70% of all of our power stations are in this province. Most of the workers are dependent on the coal mining industry. So the coal mines, the logistics, the coal-fired power stations, a couple of 100,000 workers are employed in this industry. You need an industrial policy, if you like, to correct the consequences of the green transition. You need training and retraining of those workers. You need to stimulate new industries in those areas. So I guess one of the positive reasons why an industrial policy is also required is to focus on this equity piece. And this is a political dimension, if you like, where governments take a proactive decision to invest in bringing about that equity by focusing on the sort of negative consequences of the green transition.
Just as a follow-up, do you, for an organisation like yours, do you have any concerns that where you operate in this area, you might be distorting markets, you might be crowding out other industries?
I think because we are very much focused on the private sector, on growing firms, when we make an investment, part of our due diligence involves studying these areas. Is there an active industrial policy in place? Are there incentives to stimulate a particular industry? Because, you know, if you invest in a particular industry, if the rest of the supply chains are not optimal, it could impact on the efficiency and the profitability of that particular company. So we examine that as part of a deliberate element, as part of the due diligence process when we make our investments. As you know, a lot of the frontier markets where we are invested in Africa, these are the least developed countries or low-income countries that typically do not have very well-articulated industrial policies. So it's a different kind of set of challenges that we face in those markets.
Okay, thank you. Bernardo, could I ask you, do you mind whether industrial policy is politically driven or not? Is it the results that you care about, or is it any other factors?
What I say is that industrial policy, I want to repeat, has to exist. The important that sure is the government and institution have to set up this, but the important is not the industrial policy create more bureaucracy. Because what we see also in some countries that the industrial policy give you the guideline, but for succeed the guideline, you have in front of you a wall of bureaucracy. When I say wall of bureaucracy, means that sometimes the industrial policy set a date for succeed a certain investment, a certain goal, and the bureaucracy not allowed you to achieve this. And this is, I think, is the most dangerous and most negative impact of the industrial policy.
Yeah. Maybe I'll come back to Beata on that, actually, because that point about how industrial policy works well or otherwise featured very strongly in the transition report, didn't it?
Exactly, and that's why we stress the administrative capacity, right? Because sometimes officials may hide behind a wall of bureaucracy because they don't know any better, because they think that they will look like they are doing their job. Why, streamlining policies is what's called for. So I really like the wall of bureaucracy. That's something we should be avoiding.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to come to the audience for questions in a few minutes. So if you want to ask a question in the room, just get ready for doing so. We'll bring some microphones round. But Jeremy, just to close up this section, you talked a little bit about Draghi and the EU. I'm just interested in the relationship really between the EU adopting an industrial policy and what that does for globalization, the messages that sends out there. And this is something I know you've thought about a lot.
Yeah. So it cuts both ways. It will depend on how it's executed, no? But I'm slightly worried, right? So there are two angles. One is that industrial policy driven by security concerns, it might push new forms of international integration, which are good for both sides, right? So the European Commission has been pushing something called the Trade and Investment Partnerships, and the motivation for that was very much this idea that Europe is too dependent on China, that it should try to increase global supply chain resilience, and so the way to do that is to, in some sense, lower the costs of firms, of finding new partners. And to the extent that this means lowering trade barriers with developing countries and perhaps helping these countries invest so they can become a part of a supply chain, that's a very good thing. But then there's also the other side, which is that industrial policy in the Draghi report and in the competitiveness compass of the Commission is to some extent defensive. So it does have a little bit of a protection element, particularly with respect to industries that are viewed as threatened by some combination of high energy prices and Chinese competition. And so here there is a risk, I think, that we might be subsidizing too much, that the view that subsidies should be guided by abatement, while necessary, is probably not sufficient. So I'm all in favor of keeping important parts of the production chain of energy-intensive industry in Europe, but it is possible that in order to maintain the competitiveness of this industry, intermediate products have to be imported to a greater degree than in the past, simply because importing energy directly is extremely expensive. It's very expensive to transport energy, particularly renewables energy. And so by not making that point, so you will not find this point in the Draghi report, right? I mean, the Draghi report essentially kind of suggests that if you are sort of tough on insisting that subsidies only go to firms that do abatement efforts, you're okay. You might not be okay, because in the end you might end up with an industrial structure that sucks up half of industrial energy demand in Europe to the detriment of other parts of the industrial base. And of course, it is something that developing countries will not like, because they are the ones that are in line to learn these industrial activities. They view it as an important part of their own development. So in a paper that I'm currently writing with two colleagues at Bruegel, we sort of argue that the way to reconcile the green transition or global emissions reductions with the industrial ambitions of both the EU and developing countries might be to actually promote the development of energy-intensive industry in those countries, which have a stronger comparative advantage in actually producing some of these goods, which doesn't mean that this industry has to disappear in Europe, but some of the inputs, they could come from those countries.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, well, let's take some questions from the audience. Yeah, I can see a couple of hands up already. So we bring the microphones down here, and I'll try and balance some of the questions we've got online as well, so that we can get a good share of things. So if we can bring the microphone over here. If you could just say who you are as well, that would be very helpful for the audience. Thank you.
It actually works. So my name is Eric Livni. I'm currently head of Turkmenistan for the EBRD. But I joined the bank in 2019, not as a banker, as an economist. And I'm a development economist by passion, whatever else. When joining the bank, I was to become a lead economist for Central Asia, which is a region struggling with the immense challenge of diversification. And in my naive mind, when joining the bank, I thought my job would be about analyzing the huge market failures in Central Asia and pointing directions in which the bank, we, the EBRD, can act proactively and trigger, coordinate investment by different actors along value chains to trigger development of new areas that were underdeveloped in Central Asia, away from oil, away from gas, away from mining. And very quickly I found out that my job is not about that. And whenever I raise the topic of industrial policy with Lorenzo, for example, sitting here, I was told, actually, this is not something we do at the bank. We are demand-driven bank. So what does it mean to be a demand-driven bank? Well, it means, So what it means that we are responding to demand from the private sector, if it's about private sector funding. So companies come to us, we do selection, and the nature of selection is such that we end up funding the strongest company, the strongest incumbents in pretty much every sector, because we positively select companies, not negatively, right? So we basically conserve the status quo in the economy by supporting the strongest actors. That's what we do. Now, the one area, one exception, and it exists, where we have been really transformative, that's the area of renewables. That's the area where we took a totally different approach. We were not demand-driven, we were very much supply-oriented. We created the legal frameworks, we created the mechanism through which renewable energy can be procured. We put in place, we provided the financing, we trained everybody, we organized these tenders. We basically transformed, I can tell you about Kazakhstan, a country where I spent quite a bit of time. We transformed the entire environment. So question is, can we do the same in some other areas? I mean, now that we're talking about industrial policy, I'm back to my passion.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, just before he answers, as it happens, the first question, not knowing that was the question, David doesn't give his surname, said, you mentioned how industrial policy is often reactive to what other nations are doing. He was asking about the EU. In which sector areas is the EU being proactive? What's the strategy? But in a way, really the question here is industrial policy something that needs to be more proactive than perhaps we're seeing? And maybe, well, Leslie,
I would kick off with a very short answer in the affirmative. Absolutely. There is no question that if we want to, commercialize the sort of green innovations out there, whether it be, carbon capture, battery storage, any of these, without a proactive approach, these technologies would not succeed. So the answer is very, very clear. As you've correctly pointed out, the renewable energy sector, the development finance industry in general took a very different approach. There was nothing, I agree wholeheartedly with him, there was nothing demand-driven about the approach to stimulate the green industry, quite rightly so. We need that same proactive approach for the development and the commercialization of new innovations as they come up that can fast-track the path towards net zero.
Beate, is there anything we've seen in your research that helps us with this?
So I think that the green challenge, the climate crisis gave us a path where we want to intervene. But if you go beyond green transformation, I think it's incredibly hard to pick sectors of the future. And that's the old criticism of industrial policy. But if I may go back to Eric's passionate question, let me defend the positive selection of companies. Diversification of the economy is also about exporting, and it's only companies that are already good that stand a chance of entering export markets. I mean, it's not a message government wants to hear, but that's the reality. Exporters typically are the few percent, of the distribution of firms. They are the best firms. Similarly, we make a point in the transition report that if you want to support innovation, it's rarely about SMEs. Innovation is done by larger firms because simply they have the knowledge, they have the profits, and maybe they've grown up because they are good. So if you want to support R&D, innovation, channel this support to large firms and support young firms, but not small.
But I know you probably want to come in, but I wouldn't mind just getting through some more questions. I've got a question a little further back. Sorry, Elizabeth, but
Hi.
You might be next.
Hi, I'm Ina Hoxha, Deputy CEO of Climate Bonds. Picking up on actually Beata's last point, so very nice segue, thank you for that, is that we're actually operating in an increasingly fragmented world, or global economy, I would say. So the multilateral trade system is under pressure, industrial policy is reemerging. yet much of your research exactly suggests that industrial policy works best when economies are open, they're integrated into global value chains, exporting companies especially, and subject to competitive discipline. So my question is, in this more fragmented global environment, where trade is politicized, supply chains are securitized, can actually industrial policy still deliver the kind of industrial transformation we need? Or is global integration a necessary precondition for its success? And that's on the external. But sort of an equivalent question is also on the internal economy, like structure of the economy. So if I'm Albania, I actually happen to be Albanian, what do I want to look internally? And I say, what is the capital structure of my economy? If I am more investment-based, or I have large savings but very high consumption. So in economies where consumption dominates and investment is weak, again, to your point, what are the necessary conditions for industrial policy to succeed? Can green industrial strategies be effective without first addressing the structural imbalances? So what are the external conditions and what are the internal conditions, in short?
Beata, and I wouldn't mind hearing from Jeremy on this one as well, if that's okay.
Let me just focus on one: competition. Right? When we end the transition report with a list of what you should do, build in competition into your industrial policy. I think it's underappreciated that in China, producers of electric cars have benefited from subsidies, but there is a lot of competition between them, and that's exactly what made them so good. If you are a small country, a small market that can sustain only one player in a given industry, it's very hard to have this competition without being open to trade. And that makes it much harder to succeed. And you know, the criticism of infant industry protection that German was alluding to is that typically industries that are growing behind tariff walls, they never grow up because they spend all their time lobbying for continued protection rather than focus on becoming better.
Okay.
In a fragmented world, is that still going to be possible? I mean, in a world that is not as
Well, the world, so to repeat the question, is it still possible in a fragmented world? It may be harder to have multilateral rules, but there are still very many countries that are interested in cooperation, and it is up to them to continue. And in a sense, the tariff shock we have observed has given incentives to countries to look more for preferential regional trade agreements. So I wouldn't be as pessimistic, perhaps, as you are.
Jeremy?
I mean, I agree with Beata. I think, by and large, I think that the victim or the costs of industrial policy, and their benefits too, of course, so far have been mostly fiscal. You spend money for nothing, Northvolt, that sort of thing. I don't think that it is killing globalization at this point, right? I mean, it's much more the tariffs that do that, and I obviously agree with the competition argument. And on the earlier question, I mean, the theory of change, okay, of EBRD is that no, you do it through projects, okay? You don't do it through policy mainly. And the reason why you can do it, when you can generate transition, by the way, do you guys still use the word transition impact? I mean,
Of course.
I feel good. I'm
Of course,
reassured.
Lorenzo
Okay?
sitting there.
So okay. So basically, the idea is, right, the driving intellectual justification for EBRD is that there is, in some sense, there's excess demand for credit. For finance, right? So there are credit constraints. You go in, and of course it's demand-driven, but there's too much demand for a limited supply of credit, and so you pick the firms and projects that produce the transition impact, and so you normally do not pick the incumbents unless that particular incumbent has a project that creates high transition impact, for example, because it has a demonstration effect on exporting or something like that. But indeed, sometimes these things high intention, and you may want to pick an incumbent because it's good for some transition objective, but by doing that, you are actually harming competition in the market. And so in this, if I may, I'm going to tell you an anecdote. So in 2012, 2013, the Office of the Chief Economist had its annual retreat in Belgrade. And as always, in cases like that, we went to see EBRD clients that we've been working with for a while. And so we saw this fantastic ice cream company. And, you know, they gave us lots of ice cream. We toured the factory, and we asked them, you know, and so these were one of the first private ice cream manufacturers that existed in Serbia, right? Everything else was, before it was terrible tasting ice cream from the state. And so we asked them, well, you know, it's great that, you know, you came in and you challenged this, you know, the state incumbents, and you produced, and so how are you doing as a company? And they said, oh, fantastic, we're now controlling 90% of the market in Serbia. Okay, so one has to be careful.
Yeah. I thought you were going to say it's 99. That's a very English joke. Okay, one more very quick question, because we're almost out of time. And Elisabetta, you had your hand up. This is another EBRD colleague. There's microphones coming at you from both directions. Oh. And then I'm just going to ask a very quick closing point from each of you, if that's okay. So.
Elisabetta Falcetti, Managing Director for Turkey and the Caucasus, also an ex-economist transition to banking. You can anticipate my question. So in light of the shifts in industrial policy, should we look at Turkey local content requirements on renewables in a different light? Did they get it right before the US and the EU realized that they had to support the local industry?
Anybody want to have a go at that? Jeremy?
Jeremy, you want to go? No.
Okay.
Well, both.
So why don't you go first?
Yeah.
So I don't know enough about this specific case, but I think that, as I said before, there is a catch-up argument sometimes for discriminatory policy. And so it can work. And so maybe this is the one case, or one of the cases, where it works. But it is for sure not going to be globally efficient for every country to have local content requirements going to lead to a collapse in trade. And so the fact that this is one case where it might have been justified does not lead me to want to generally endorse this as a principle.
Beata, briefly, if you may.
I think it's a broader question, right? Should we continue to uphold principles of multilateralism in a world where many of our shareholding countries are actively pursuing industrial policies? And you know, it's at some point it may become harder to convince our clients that that's the right thing to do, if that's not what many advanced economies are doing.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to ask one short closing thought from each of you, same question, and I'll start with you, Leslie, which is that when you think about industrial policy, optimistic, pessimistic, where are you on that scale?
I'm no doubt, there's no question in my mind that I'm in the optimistic mode, and the reason for that, we have seen some great success stories of how targeted, coordinated industrial policy can produce superior outcomes. There's a need to use the R&D, the innovation that is currently underway towards the net zero green transition. There's a need to provide leadership, industrial leadership in that. And it won't happen just through, because there's too many market failures. It won't happen just through firms competing by itself. You need infrastructure, as I said earlier, you need the ecosystem, or you need systemic innovation, not just a little innovation here or there to bring about the kind of industrial change that is required to reach net zero.
Okay. Bernardo, can I ask you, optimistic, pessimistic?
I say also before, optimistic or pessimistic, I say that have to be consistent. Sorry if I repeat always the same concept. From my point of view, for example, the industrial policy the European Community put in place, sometimes are completely negative, and I'm very pessimistic related to this, because they can create internally of European Community more competition. I tell you, for example, related to the price of energy and all the argument related to the electricity and the index where you can count the price of energy in a different country. This is terrible, and European Community, Brussels, I think, can help the tough of the industrial sector against other continents. And today, I think if Europe is not to wake up very fast in a very concrete way, I think that for European industry it's not easy to compete against other continents. This is my point of view.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So finally, Jeremy and Beata, very briefly as well, because we do need to finish because people have other sessions to go to. Jeremy, please.
So I'm very optimistic, mostly because I think there will be less industrial policy in the future. And the reason for that is that both the US and China are beyond peak industrial policy. So the US for ideological reasons, I think the IRA was wonderful as a climate instrument. I also think it was excessive on subsidies because both subsidies on the renewable energy side, so the demand side of the clean tech market, and on the supply side of the clean tech market, right? Not justifiable really with climate objectives. There was a nationalist objective there. So that's no longer happening to that degree. And I think in China, you know, there's less because they partly have achieved their aims, right? They have the scale now, and also for fiscal reasons, they cannot afford it. And so there's a certain danger that in Europe, we are now sort of pursuing a European version of Bidenomics that is a little bit behind the times. And we should have a more focused and more discriminating approach to industrial policy.
Fascinating, thank you. Beata, last word.
Industrial policy is as much about picking winners as it is about letting losers go. So if we use industrial policy to build sectors of the future rather than helping industries in trouble, then I am optimistic.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Well, there we have it. Thank you very much indeed for coming to this. Thank you to our panellists. Just let me very briefly say, if you want to see the full transition report, I think we're going to put the link up on the screen, but you can just find it easily by searching. And we'll be posting a podcastable version of this if you want to relive the whole experience. So thank you very much indeed for joining. See you at another session. Thank you.